Hello everyone, my name is Daniel Backer and welcome to Off the Wall Novels. No Pringle today, he is upstairs sleeping in his cage, but I am going to be talking about The World That Jones Made by Philip K. Dick. He is an author that I really like, and this book explores a lot of themes that I really like about philosophy and relativism. And if you've ever watched the channel before, you know I love that stuff. You could say that's like the only stuff that I love. I'm always complaining that I'm getting sick of these postmodern novels that explore these ideas. Just when I thought I was out, they pull me back in. I think one of the things I really like about Philip K. Dick and this book in particular is that he takes a lot of these philosophical investigations that are dominant in postmodern fiction, and he condenses it to something that's extremely accessible and has a bit of a story behind it. There are precogs who can tell the future. We have shape-shifting mutants. We have sci-fi spores that are drifting into Earth in order to seal us into a weird bubble. All of this adds up, I think, to a really interesting comment on relativism. But before I get into it today, I want to mention that I'm actually releasing a novel on August 15th called Lionel, Lancet, and the Right Vibe. And this was definitely influenced by some of the ideas that you can find in The World That Jones Made. So the way that Philip K. Dick puts that into The World That Jones Made is with two conflicting views. There is government-mandated relativism within society. If you threaten this government-mandated relativism too much, then they'll throw you in a labor camp. It's basically Jordan Peterson's greatest fear. And I mention him in particular because I think a lot of his anxieties about relativism and the apparent nihilism that it might usher in are reflected in this book, even though this was written back in the 1950s. And so I'll talk a little bit more about him in a minute, because the book also mentions basically gender relativism and like trans bathroom issues in its own like 1950s way. So we'll get into that in just a moment. And we have a precog, Jones, who can tell the future a year in advance. And if you can't tell already, being able to accurately predict the future basically equals absolutism. Truth is set in stone. He knows exactly what's going to happen, and it does happen. Now, one of the great things about Philip K. Dick is that he manages to put these big ideas into the story in a way that it seems very natural, but then it also makes us ask questions about our own lives and our own belief systems. Since there is this government-mandated relativism, this gives some of the characters in this story this sense of nihilism, that there isn't any stability that an absolute truth might provide. And a lot of those people end up being attracted to Jones's philosophy because it is stable. Having an absolute truth does give you this feeling of certainty that would be nice. The anxieties about relativism and the nihilism that it might usher in, I think, are best voiced by the character Nina. And so when they go to this nightclub that has these shape-shifting mutant dancers and these drugs that they order just straight to the table, you basically see Nina dealing with this feeling of nihilism, of living in the government-mandated relativism. And she, I think, expresses this very well. And she says, referring to the world that Jones made, at least it'll have meaning. We'll be doing something. Nina's voice trailed off, moving farther away from them. It'll be for something. To which her husband replies unhappily, that's empty idealism. Nina didn't answer. She had disappeared into an inner world. Her face was blank, devoid of personality. So when I first started to read about this, I was wondering, like, is this what Philip K. Dick thinks about the world? And I don't remember him telegraphing like his own beliefs about society that much. So I was worried when I was reading this, is like, oh, is this just going to be like railing against the potential nihilism that postmodern philosophy and relativism might usher in? And so I was even more worried, like I said, when he does start talking about gender relativism. And keep in mind, this was written in the 1950s, so he refers to these shape-shifting mutants as hermaphrodites. And then I get that it's extremely problematic to even represent them as mutants. But I think as the book goes on, it becomes clear that he's not trying to make any kind of statement about gender. I think the reason that this book includes this is to show that traditional categories are destabilized within relativism. And I think personally the ending demonstrates that Philip K. Dick thinks that that might actually be a good thing outside of any government mandate, that is. Then I got a little even more nervous about this when on page 83, one of the characters says, "We were wondering how those hermaphrodites decide. That is, while Nina and I were in there," referring to the bathroom, one of them might come in too, and we wouldn't know whether to resent it. So I get that through a contemporary context, this does seem like he's trying to explore this idea that a lot of people have used in order to limit trans people's rights of using restrooms by saying that this is a threat to women in some way. This is like not a thing. I'll link some videos in the description of people speaking on this much more in depth. The channel that I think expresses this the best is Contrapoints. Her video on J.K. Rowling in particular, I think really says this better than I can. And so the idea of people going into different bathrooms depending on what gender they are is a social convention. So this image within the book, I think, actually explores that very well, even though it's kind of clouded by our contemporary thinking about it. So even though I've dominantly just talked about the philosophy and the ideas within this story, we can't forget this is a Philip K. Dick sci-fi novel. The book opens up with this kind of cryptic scene with these mutants that are inside of this dome in San Francisco that's apparently been controlled, we find out later, to simulate the environment on Venus. However, in that opening scene, we don't really know what's going on. He also gives us this idea of the drifters, and the drifters are these things that Jones tells us about. He mentions that the drifters are really what the police need to be worried about. And he doesn't really tell us what the drifters are. This suspended information, I think, is the thing that keeps the narrative moving forward in spite of all of the character desires and motivations that are offered. I really like it when books do this. This creates a little bit of suspense. The way that Philip K. Dick keeps us turning pages is by giving us that mysterious scene of the mutants at the beginning, and it's only later that we find out that they are mutants. They were intentionally made as mutants in order to continue the human species on Venus. And the reason I say human is because this raises the question, if they're genetically modified and they aren't exactly human anymore, it's almost as though we have a relativistic understanding of what a human is. And that's another way that he instantiates that theme of relativism within the dominant narrative action of the book. After Jones's government has replaced the government that mandated relativism, there is a radio broadcast that says, in the first 72 hours of the crisis government, there has already been a marked change in the people's morale. The previous apathy and futility that characterized life under the FedGov system has vanished. The man in the street has a new zest, a new purpose in life. He now has confidence in his leaders. He knows that his leaders will act. He knows his leaders are not corrupted by intellectual paralysis. Now, even though I am a fan of relativism and postmodern philosophy and everything like that, I definitely have been concerned about this at various points, that sometimes it becomes such a tangle of intellectual masturbation where you're trying to deconstruct language and every traditional way of understanding things that you feel like you don't have any firm ground to stand on. Now, I think that the answer to this, and something that Jordan Peterson gets wrong and a lot of critics of postmodernism get wrong, is the idea that relativism and postmodern philosophy are basically just another tool in your toolbox. They shouldn't be held up as a new absolute truth, that absolute truth being that there is no absolute truth, so up is down and right is left and nothing means anything. The most charitable interpretation of postmodern philosophy is that it's a way to unmask your own biases, a way to maybe look at the way that you look at things in order to reveal if how you look at things is distorting your perception in some way. That doesn't mean you're supposed to necessarily throw away the way that you look at things. It's just to see if you might be making some hidden assumptions that are baked into the way that you look at the world. I think that the postmodern philosophers, some of them anyway, were actually clear about this in their writing, that they were saying this should not become a new meta-narrative of the world. It's just a way to critique your biases and your hidden assumptions about things. But to be fair, like I said, at its worst, relativism and postmodern philosophy can lead to, like they said, intellectual paralysis, and anything offering a sense of objectivity or absolutism outside of that might actually get rid of your apathy and your resentment and the feeling of futility that characterized life under the FedGov system, as mentioned in this paragraph. And it offers a sense of purpose and confidence in leaders. But this is, I think, the dark shade of absolutism that Philip K. Dick is trying to indicate in this book. That sense of absolutism that's offered and that sense of stability and seeming objectivity actually becomes something that leaders can use to manipulate people. And the way that the book concludes, it's basically revealed that this guy who can tell the future, even though he can provide us that sense of objectivity, he is a bit of a narcissist, and he's more concerned with his legacy, because as the drifters are coming to Earth, it's revealed that it's actually just like a spore and an egg that are going to create these enormous beings that might be like plants that are just so much bigger than us. It's said that like humanity by comparison is the size of a virus, essentially. And what they're actually coming to do, rather than colonize us, is to just seal us off in like a bubble. And so since Jones was only able to see about a year into the future, he actually didn't know that they were going to do this. And so after all of these people banded behind him, it turned out that he had all of these fleets of ships going out on a fool's errand, essentially, because the drifters had already won. And this threatened to tarnish Jones's legacy. Now, Cusick, the detective that I actually haven't talked a whole lot about, even though he is like one of the main characters in the book, he comes and assassinates Jones, and he thinks that he's won. But then in their apartment, he and Nina's apartment, they go back, and Jones, I guess, has recorded this audio message revealing his big plan, that he let Cusick kill him, and everyone was going to be mad at Cusick now because Jones was the savior from the drifters, and if Jones is already dead, then nobody can blame Jones, and everybody will blame Cusick instead for killing Jones, the guy who might have saved them from what turned out to be the drifters' plan. So in order to escape the potential angry mob that is surely coming for Cusick after he's killed Jones, he and his wife go to Venus. It's revealed that they live next to these mutants that were being prepared to live on Venus, and it seems like the mutants are doing a pretty good job. They're hanging out on Venus, they're harvesting corn, there's a new baby in the picture, everybody's having a blast. I think that some of the imagery of the constructed world and little bubble that Cusick and his wife have to live in the end on Venus is a bit of a metaphor or an image that demonstrates the idea that this constructed world as offered by relativism is actually something that is a good thing, that it sustains their life and prevents them from having to do government-mandated relativism, but then also the false absolutism and certainty offered by Jones. I think that this is demonstrated when the mutants who were altered in order to survive on Venus are talking about Cusick and his wife. I feel sorry for them. You do? Why? Because it's awful. You remember, living like that, shut up in a little glass box. Someday they'll be able to go back, Frank reminded her. And remember, he knows why he's here. He decided it was voluntary. It has a purpose. They're able to live in this false world that they build for themselves on Venus. It's nice because it's a relativism. It's a reality that is contingent on the social context being Venus, and it's not mandated by this government. It's voluntary, and it gives him a purpose that ends up not being an issue because they decided that they can live there. And I think the thriving society built by the mutants on Venus ends up being an image that says that these Venusians, who are relativism embodied by virtue of being mutants, end up building a happy world for themselves. And so it's not that relativism is this nihilistic, dark thing that somebody like Jordan Peterson might say it is. In the right context, provided that it's a choice, it can actually provide a free world for flourishing and things like that. So that's all that I have for you today. This has been Off the Wall Novels. Please feel free to leave a comment. What is your favorite Philip K. Dick book? Thank you. Goodbye.